våga sig. Men molnen bara hopar sig. Känner du?
Good afternoon, everyone. We don't have many people in the room yet because it's lunchtime, but I don't want to make people that are online wait longer. So I'm happy to invite you all to participate today in a discussion on changing how we build. And our focus today will be on the issue related to construction materials specifically. Construction materials is an area that has, I guess, been overlooked to some extent or not given the importance that it should have. There's been a lot of focus on looking at operational energy in buildings and energy efficiency, mitigation, decarbonization, but the whole issue of embodied carbon has been actually not really tackled that much, but it's gaining traction and attention. So I'm happy that we can discuss this topic here at the One Planet Network Forum today. In terms of, sorry, I need to find. Oh, yep, thank you, sorry. So just in terms of the agenda today, so we will have first two presentations to set the scene. One presentation that will be speaking about the way the Nordic countries are actually taking into account the issue of circularity, embodied carbon materials in the construction sector. And then a second presentation that I will be making that will emphasize a little bit on what the issue exactly is and show that we are actually going to give more attention to this topic in the coming years, starting actually in 2022. So next we will have a panel discussion where we will have 6 distinguished panel members to give their perspectives on this issue. And I will be happy to introduce the panel members when we get there. So maybe as a next step, and since we're already a little bit late, I'd like to invite Harri Akaste, who works at the Ministry of Environment of Finland, to present to us the work of the Nordic countries on embodied carbon circularity materials. And you can actually use this, and yeah, a microphone, I guess.
Yes.
So, over to you.
Thanks, Jonathan. So, Harri Akaste from the Ministry of Environment, Finland.
I don't know why the next slide is.
They
got reversed, the slides. It seems.
Okay, let's try to manage this. So, I'm trying to tell you how and why Nordic countries are trying to be like a forerunners in integrating embodied carbon in the building regulation. So, and this is the one slide that had to be before the previous one. But this is the one that I will start with. Something about why we are doing it in Nordic countries. First of all, we have a long tradition of cooperating in this governmental level, in ministerial level, but also in local and administrative level. And building policies is one issue that we have been cooperating a lot last years. Of course, we have a very same kind of climatic conditions in Nordic countries. We have cold climate, which also reflects to the building materials and building techniques that we use in Nordic countries. The use of wood is very common in Finland, in Sweden and Norway, which is one of the drivers of like embedding or having these materials issues in our building policies. And it's a fact also that we have a very common building material market. We have lots of building companies that operate in Nordic countries, maybe not in Iceland, but other countries, and also building product manufacturers and also consultants that work in all Nordic countries. And besides that, we have all Nordic countries have quite ambitious climate targets. Actually, Norway maybe is the first country in the world to receive or achieve climate neutrality. Their target is to achieve it by 2030. Finland's target is 2035, and Sweden will have it the same target in 2045. So these countries are kind of forerunners in this field. And it's also a fact that we have a long tradition of having building policies connected to energy efficiency in Nordic countries because of the cold climate that we have. And because of that, we have already, I think that we have done a lot at that field, and now we are in the end of that path. And now we have to take some new challenges, and focusing on building materials is one of the challenges that we are now taking. And last but not least, we have 3 of Nordic countries are members of EU, and cooperating with each other, between each other, we can have a strong impact on EU policies, of course, too. So Nordic countries share a common sustainable vision called Our Vision 2030. Here you can see the contents of the vision. The aim is to become the most sustainable and integrated region in the world, and it has 3 dimensions or targets, differentiated targets. There is the green transition that we are aiming at in our societies and work. There's competitiveness of our region. Then we talk about knowledge, innovation, mobility, and digital integration. And of course, Nordic countries are also famous for our socially sustainable communities, and this is one dimension in our vision in Nordic countries. But when we talk about built environment, as I told before, we have a long tradition of cooperating in ministerial level, but we have also a long tradition of cooperating in the administrative level or authority level, in ministerial level. These ministers of housing put up a Nordic Declaration of Low Carbon and Construction and Circular Principles in the construction sector on 2019, and in the same year we organized the first Nordic Climate Forum of Construction in Malmö in Sweden, and after that this forum has been organized every year by a different Nordic country being the leader of the forum. But when it comes to actual activities that we are doing at the moment, and the basis of these activities is this Nordic Sustainable Construction Program, started last year and will last until 2024. And here you can see the 5 work packages that this program contains of. And here I could tell a little bit more about this life cycle assessment and data, which is led by our ministry. And in that work package we also have a target of a little bit trying to harmonize these Nordic LCA practices and even maybe regulation in Nordic countries. The other work packages contain circular business models and procurement, sustainable construction and materials and architecture, emissions-free construction sites, and program secretariat and capacity building, which is led by Danish Housing and Planning Authority. And all these work packages, as you can see, are led by different Nordic countries. But maybe most interesting part of what we are at the moment doing is the regulation that we are developing in all Nordic countries. And you may probably wonder why Estonia is part of this group now. It's because Finland has a close relation to Estonian administration, and they have asked to become member of this Nordic group in this development. But in this table you can see how the development has, how the situation has developed in regulatory aspect, and you can see that the basis for the regulation in each country is the climate declaration, which is being prepared in all Nordic countries. And Sweden, as first of the countries, has put their regulation on already in the beginning of this year, including this climate declaration, demand for climate declaration. Denmark will be the next one in the beginning of next year, and they will also include in their regulation a demand for carbon footprint limit values as a first country, perhaps in the world. And our country, Finland, has been developing our regulation since 3 years now. And in the next slide, I can show the basic elements of the Finnish low-carbon regulation. The basis, as in other Nordic countries, is the climate declaration, which is demanded for new buildings and major renovations, and it's assessed for 50 years, and it consists of 2 parts: a carbon footprint, the straight CO2 emissions from the building, and the carbon handprint, which refers to the positive climate effects that the building has. And this climate declaration is based on an assessment method that we have been developing now for 3 years. This method is based on EN standards, European standards, and this assessment method itself is based on national emissions database called CO2 data.fi, which consists of generic material data and LCA data from the different life cycle stages of the building. And besides this, we will also develop, not yet done, but will develop limit values for carbon footprint of the building for this 50 years. And this will be developed to major building types, not private houses, but it's only considered for carbon footprint. So, and here in this table you can see the comparison of the different life cycle stages, how they are included in this in different countries' regulation at the moment. And as you can see, this product manufacturing phase is included in all these countries that are included in this cooperation. But there are differences in other stages. As you can see on the right-hand side, there's also comparison how EU voluntary levels reporting system is reflecting to these life cycle stages. And underneath you can see that for how many years are these calculations made in each country. Last but not least, I will tell something about also this circularity aspect in low carbon building, and I would like to emphasize the connection of the low carbon and embedded carbon with circular aspects of the building. But besides that, we have this program that I described before. We have another program called Nordic Networks for Circular Construction, which also includes several working packages that you can probably or not can see on the left-hand side in this table. And all these working packages are led by different Nordic countries. So this is an activity that is going on until 2024 also. So this is maybe kind of a introduction to this point, and I think that Nordic countries being like forerunners, we of course hope that there will be lots of other countries that are following this path. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Harry, for this presentation. And I definitely can see, and you definitely all could see, that the Nordic countries are the real front runners in this area. I don't think in the world there are any others. Canada is making some important steps. Netherlands are making some important steps. But in the rest of the world, it's a topic that has not been really tackled much yet. So I wanted to kind of give a little bit of an overall overview. I'll run quickly through my presentation because we're already about 15 minutes late. But I still think it's worth emphasizing the issue. So one of the key points that I would like to put forward first is that construction is still booming. Maybe not that much in Europe. In Europe, we talk more about renovation, which is also linked to construction. But when we think about new buildings, well, about half of the buildings that will be standing there in 2050 have not yet been built. And the majority of those constructions will happen in Asia and Africa. And of course, when we look at that, the consumption of materials is going to increase, and the pressure on the resources will actually be extremely strong over the coming years in these countries. And it's really a window of opportunity now to try to influence and change and transform the way buildings and construction is happening, so that we don't lock in all this embodied carbon and we don't lock in into practices that actually are not sustainable. If you look at the climate area, I mean, it was mentioned, and Harry mentioned it. One of the reasons also to look at this specific issue is that in the context of climate, it's really important to look at the embodied carbon part. And as you can see from these slides, actually 10% of the emissions, global energy emissions, are actually coming from the materials and the construction part. I mean, of course, we have like some major materials like cement, steel, that are the most in demand and having very high impact. And then, of course, sand and gravel, which are another big issue. Everybody knows that there's an important crisis in terms of sand availability. Now, looking at new constructions, there's been a lot of focus, like I said earlier, about operational carbon. But over time, actually, and especially in the new construction, embodied carbon and operational carbon are like almost getting to the same level, 50-50 in terms of the share. So the share of embodied carbon is actually a very important share that, if you look at the previous slide I had, you could see that the operations were more or less 75%, 70% of the emissions, and then the smaller part, 30%, were like coming from the materials. But over time, actually, especially with all the new construction, it's actually going to be half-half. We've been actually working on this topic for some years, not having, I think a number of organizations and people have had that issue in mind, but it has not, I think, yet had the traction it needs from like the high-level decision makers and the governments to actually also really push this agenda. Under the One Planet Network Sustainable Building and Construction Program, we've been focusing quite a lot on the issue of how does this whole building sector contribute to the different SDGs, and how can circularity really enhance solving in a way part of that issue related to the resources that are used in the construction sector. And as you can see, the idea is to actually push the sector to be more circular as one of the main ways to address the issue. And Harry mentioned it also in his presentation. The Nordic countries specifically, and also the Netherlands, are putting quite a lot of emphasis actually on circularity. Another program that we are hosting under the United Nations Environment Program, the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, has been working more under the climate agenda specifically, while the SBC program has been very much linked to SDG 12, as you know. But under the climate agenda, we brought together under Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction, with actually France was the one that started the Global Alliance at COP15 to actually bring a common vision on how to decarbonize the sector. And there was an approach developed on how to holistically do the transformation. And it focused on 8 areas, and materials being a critical area to look into. Currently, when we are working with countries on that topic, it's very difficult to find data, information. So there's a lot of work that actually needs to be done to understand better also what is exactly the material that is consumed, so that we can better know what actions need to be taken behind it. So as I was mentioning earlier, the idea is really to move from a focus on operational carbon to what we call whole life carbon, or a more life cycle approach to look at the buildings and construction sector overall. As you can see on the slide, the embodied carbon is all the manufacture, the transport, and the installation of the materials. And on the other hand, you have like the use of the building, so it's the energy consumption of the building. And it's clearly evidence that today there's been a lot of work on the operational side. If you look at the NDCs, so the National Determined Contributions, the second most cited action in terms of mitigation is about building energy codes and energy efficiency in buildings. So in my view, that is something that the decision makers and are all agreeing that it needs to happen, and they have actually integrated it and are actually going towards solving the issue. Not that the issue is solved yet, a lot of work is still needed, but actually we are going in the right direction there. However, in nearly no NDCs, embodied carbon materials are mentioned. And so it's really time to kind of move towards giving a stronger emphasis on that. And under the UNFCCC, there is what is called the Marrakesh Partnership for Global Climate Action, which is led by the climate champions. And at the last COP, actually, there was the human settlements pathway that was launched, where actually the vision is integrating both the issue of embodied carbon and looking more at the operational carbon, but also including the embodied carbon in it. So here you have like the 2 main goals that were put forward, and the global ABC community overall was very strongly involved in helping shaping that agenda. Now, we also know from the International Resource Panel, who released the report on resource efficiency and climate change, that to actually address the climate issue in the construction sector and housing sector, there is a big benefit on looking at material efficiency strategies. Material efficiency strategies is still something I think that needs to be defined better, but some of the thoughts, at least coming up now, is about, on the one hand, looking at avoiding the use of materials, so circularity aspects, looking at using less and looking more at the life cycle, but then also shifting to other materials, I mean, bio-based materials or even vernacular materials and techniques that existed in countries and have been superseded by, the concrete, glass, and steel that is kind of the common way of constructing everywhere today. But finally, also we cannot avoid the conventional materials. So there's also a very important aspect to look at how can we improve the current materials so that they are less carbon intensive. So talking about low carbon cement or other types of technologies. So that's one of the things I think that can illustrate what material efficiency strategies would be about. It's about avoid, shift, and improve. Now, this year under UNEP, we are starting actually quite a bit of work with the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction and also with the One Planet Sustainable Buildings and Construction program, where we will be actually pushing more strongly that specific agenda. We are starting a global study that will actually be pointing at what is really the issue and kind of put forward some policy recommendations on it. That study will be led by the Yale University and is actually currently happening and will be issued at the end of the year. And we will also be establishing an information hub on the topic, specifically under the GlobalABC platform. And the idea there, again, is more to see how we can influence the policymakers and how we can take the best practices, for example, or at least the experience, from the countries that are more advanced and bring it to the countries that, are starting to think about that topic on how they could tackle it. So, yeah, I will stop my presentation here. So that's actually what I wanted to say to set the scene. But so this is really an area that, is gaining a lot of traction. A lot of the stakeholders are really now strongly engaged to look more deeply in this issue of embodied carbon and materials and how to overcome the challenges that are related to it. Now, on this note, I will be inviting the panel members to join me on stage. I think maybe some of them will need to get some microphones. I know we have 4 microphones here, but maybe 1 or 2 of you want to have one of those headsets. Or we can share the microphones as you prefer. We can share the microphones. It's easier. Yeah. Well, thank you. Yeah, Andrew, sorry. Let me move this here. And so in our panel today, we have Donovan Story, who works for RAIL. RAIL is an organization that actually supports the development of affordable housing programs and helps, especially around the world, the investment part and integrating the climate-smart approach into affordable housing. We have Samantha Stratton-Short, who is the head of Strategic Initiative and Infrastructure and Project Management Group at UNOPS. And we have Sheikh Fofana, who is from the Ministry of Environment of Senegal, and he's the Director of Environment and Classified Establishments. We have Magali Anderson, who is the Chief Sustainability and Innovation Officer for Holcim. We have Roland Unziker, who is the co-chair of the Global Alliance for Building and Construction, but also the director of the built environment in the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. And finally, we have my colleague Andrew Rood, from the who is a Human Settlements Officer, so in UN Habitat. So I'm going to start the panel just with maybe everyone giving a little bit of its perspective, and I will ask you to be rather short because we don't have much time, and I would like to make sure we have time to have a little bit of interaction between the panel members and possibly also a bit of interaction with the audience and maybe even a little bit of interaction with the virtual audience. So and I would like to start with Donovan. And Donovan, I know that RAIL's mission is to build and support affordable homes that will improve the lives of 100 million people, so across Africa and Asia. Billion, maybe for the future. Well, that's what we hope. No, it's not only about the 100 million now; it's about the rest of the world later also. But can you tell us a bit about the importance of investment and entrepreneurship to actually support this goal, and how can we ensure that the finance supports and promotes the use of sustainable materials in the development of affordable housing projects?
Thanks, Jonathan. And I'll be brief with these initial points, and then we can elaborate further if you like. So I think it's really important that we understand finance a little bit differently. I think what's become clear over the last couple of days as well, and is one of the challenges that we face, is that quite often we see finance as a barrier rather than an enabler of change. And that's partly because we often plan, we often have ambitions, we often develop frameworks, your very ambitious frameworks, Jonathan, that you've got up there, without paying reference to how these will be financed or who will finance these ambitions. So I think that if we want finance to enable change rather than to become a barrier to change, then we need to build in our understanding of how we're going to finance this transition right from the start and not use it as an add-on. And I think in terms of that, we know that there is a lot of potential innovative finance out there. But if you talk to those that are wanting to invest, they often make the point that there aren't the projects to invest in. There aren't bankable projects. There aren't defined, clear objectives backed by data, backed by an evidence base on which they can invest in change. Likewise, we know there is a huge demand for finance, and those areas, including, say, for example, 1.8 billion people that live in substandard housing, can't get access to finance. So we have this gap between basically finance and need. And it's in that gap that we really have to think very creatively about what are those impediments about financing these transitions in terms of a low-carbon built environment where we have the desperate need to create those cities of the future in different ways, but we have finance which can't find things to finance, can't find things to invest in, or actors to invest in as well. So I think that until we are able to overcome that, then finance will stick with business as usual. Finance will continue to invest in the materials that we don't want to use. Investors will continue to build infrastructure that we don't want. And we will continue this pathway simply because this is essentially an established, profitable supply chain. It's an established, understood, easy way of building infrastructure. And that's something that we really have to disrupt. And we need to create, I think, innovative projects and enabling projects to bring that finance into those areas. The second of the 3 points is that I think that our solutions can't just be about projects or individual cities or what have you. They have to be scalable. They have to be at a scale that's ambitious and it's also holistic. So we're not building better public buildings or one better suburb over here or one better city over there, but essentially we're looking at the whole picture and we're able to support and identify and support, those innovations which really leapfrog, and to be able to back those with equity and other forms of investment to be able to get them to scale. And here I think, and Fafana may speak to this, public policy has a really critical role to play as an enabler. And that is that often we have fragmented projects and we have fragmented actors because there sometimes is a lack of effective public policy, building codes, incentives for green finance that de-risks investment into new areas. And here public policy, I think, can play a really critical role to catalyse change and what have you, and also to gather the data and the evidence that's required to invest in new forms of infrastructure, new materials, and new actors. And I think for my final of the 3 points is that we need solutions that are fit for purpose in terms of the purpose that we've talked about, in terms of a low carbon, a climate smart future and resilient future, but we also need solutions which are fit for people. And here I'd really like to focus on the demand side, Jonathan. I'd really like to bring attention to the demand side. A lot of the frameworks that we have and the plans and the goals and the ambitions are fundamentally about supply, in terms of supplying information. This is a great idea. This is important for the planet. This is important for our future. But we need to empower people to demand those materials, and we need to empower people to be able to identify and want those materials. Otherwise, the SMEs and the businesses that are moving into the space simply won't have the market. I mean, we can't just supply innovative materials and innovative buildings if no one can afford them or wants them. So we have to really focus on that demand side. We need a greater understanding of people's willingness to pay and ability to pay, particularly for affordable housing and affordable infrastructure. We need to get over the problems of creditworthiness and people's inability to access finance. If you take the example of affordable housing, for example, let's say Pakistan, over 200 million people, has around 60,000 active mortgages. The mortgage market just doesn't exist. So the mortgage market for green buildings is certainly not going to exist. It's a fragment of a fraction. So we need to really work out how we get people, in terms of our work in affordable housing, how we get people into these homes and how we get them demanding and needing and wanting and understanding the importance of greener and cleaner housing. And this is also important. So let's not just focus on the supply side, but let's also understand the demand, and let's also understand the demand from consumers and the need for consumers for this change as well. And it also includes one very final point, and that also includes municipal government and local government, because much of these frameworks and much of our approach focuses on national government and global actors. But municipal government has a key role to play in implementation, but often is the weakest financial actor of all of these and the weakest planning actor of all of these. So we also need to bring municipal government much more, I think, into the conversation as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Donovan. You mentioned, different things, quite a number of them, but, the role of policy. I mean, the role, I think, on the one hand, there is also a role for international organizations, a role for the business sector. So we have the representatives here from all these different constituencies, I would say, and the need for all these actors to really work together. I think that's a very important point, and that's also, I think, the aim of platforms like the SBC or even the Global Alliance for Buildings and Construction. It's actually bringing all the actors around the table towards a common vision. I think it was very interesting to look at the demand side of issue, because I think that's a real challenge. But then talking about the policies, and I will turn to Sheikh to actually, but I think in the policies, one of the challenges that we see is that even when the policies are there, some of the challenges are also like, how do we enforce the policies? And even if you look at building codes, for example, a number of countries have building codes, and even if you look at a country like India, who have actually pretty strong building codes today, their whole challenge today is like, okay, how do we manage to actually get them enforced and implemented? So, Sheikh, I would like to get your perspective, on what you think is the role of policies in facilitating the transitions towards sustainable materials and addressing embodied carbon. I know that in Senegal, there are a number of steps taken into that direction. There is a strong interest to actually promote the local materials, or even to come up with innovations like Tifa boards, which Tifa is a weed that grows in the Senegal River, and that now they are starting to use to develop some panels that actually can use for insulation in the buildings. So, yes, just to hear your perspective.
Yes, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Yes, I think that policies can indeed have an effect on moving toward various means, such as the development of building regulation that promote the prescription of low-carbon materials by architects. The implementation of economic and financial instruments such as exemption, tax on bio-based material, etc. The support to small and medium enterprise for a sustainable production of low-carbon material and everywhere available for the market. The development of labels that promote construction based on this type of materials. And last but not least, the development of technical capacities, the training of artisans who produce and use these materials. And in Senegal, various policies have been developed or are underway in recent years to promote low carbon materials. This includes, for instance, the revision of laws and regulations governing the construction sector, the establishment of tax incentives that favor the use of local materials such as compressed earth block, the elaboration of rules of good practices for TIFA, as you said, earth material such as TIFA earth block, TIFA earth slab, TIFA chassis, etc., etc. The TIFA is an invasive plant, is an invasive species who flows in the Senegal River, and they cause many damage. And at least we use now this TIFA into construction. Yes. This work is conducted under the direction of the Senegalese Association of Standardization. Now we have standard regarding this part and to include all this in construction sector. And the ongoing development of energy and environmental regulations that will promote the use of these low carbon materials, and the development of eco-neighborhood, yes, construction operation, where the private sector is accompanied by partners such as the French Agency for Ecological Transition or Urbanism. And the construction of this eco-neighborhood, the use of low-carbon materials is innovative cooling systems such as vegetation, the use of renewable energy, and the implementation of sustainable development operation will be encouraged. This question also is taken into account our INDC draft the energy efficiency. This is, Mr. Moderator, my contribution to this important panel, and thank you very much for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Sheikh. I mean, you mentioned quite a bit the private sector, and I know that when we talk private sector, especially in a country like Senegal, we talk about a lot small and medium enterprises. But we have some representatives here from the private sector that are with us here around the table. And maybe I'll start with Roland, because of, Roland, you have more of a role with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development that is broadly coordinating the private sector. Maybe less SMEs engaged in WBCSD today, but still, I'm sure it's a very important area that you also look into, and especially for the countries we're talking about. And so I'm going to ask more like thinking about the bigger corporations, and what do you think their role is in terms of generalizing decarbonization and resilience solutions in the built environment, and maybe more specifically to think about, the materials aspect and the life cycle approach, which I know is something that is being pushed very strongly from your side.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Jonathan. I hope I don't skip the line. Thank you for addressing me at this point. Maybe just briefly, to understand who we are at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. These are indeed 220 global companies. They come from 23 different sectors, and they all want to drive a more sustainable world. Our vision is 9 billion people living well within the limits of the planet. And all these companies, as part of WBCSD, they take commitments to be net zero, to become net zero. Nobody is it yet. To become net zero. Look at strategies to become nature positive, so also integrating nature into decision making, and also having policies around diversity, human rights, and really driving the S in the ESG agenda also as companies. But they also come to WBCSD because they need to collaborate with each other along their value chains, but also, and we see that increasingly, with cities, with governments, because we can only solve these challenges ultimately together, by working together. And So maybe back to the point, whether it is an SME or a large corporate, we're all in the same boat. Now, you could argue many SMEs are maybe part of the supply chain of a large corporate. Sometimes they start feeling the pressure. They start questions being asked because companies with net zero commitments, quite frankly, many of them have those in the scope 3. Scope 3 emissions in corporate speak are those emissions that don't occur within your own boundaries, but upstream in your supplies. And so there's a whole chain reaction that needs to happen. And so we believe that a global group like coming together in WBCSD can really be a force for positive change by working together. Now, maybe bringing that back to built environment, I'm very pleased that Magali is here with us as well, because Holcim is obviously one of the key stakeholders when it comes to built environment. You asked, what do companies ultimately need? Obviously, they want to decarbonize themselves, yes. But they're part of a market that needs to change. Otherwise, they cannot change their own behavior or business practices. So I think one thing we have achieved that we need, and you presented that earlier on, we need a common vision. Where are we actually going? Even before that, we need a common understanding of the problem. And we know today that the built environment is 40% of the emissions, because we're looking as well at the energy use that happens during the use of buildings, but also the materials and the whole construction process. So we need to look at it as a system, and we need to have strategies that really tackle the decarbonization at that systemic level. And so I'm very pleased that at the COP26 in Glasgow, we were able to go with a large group of organizations to have the human settlements pathway and say we need to halve emissions by 2030 in this sector. And we need to get to net zero by 2050 or earlier, quite frankly, if that's possible. So that's something we've achieved, but that now needs to, we need to start working on that. And to your point, Donovan, that shouldn't just be in some book. So how are we going to do this? How are we also going to get finance into that? So I think the next key aspect, and again, Hari talked a lot about that, the life cycle approach. So really understanding buildings as a system and looking at what we call a whole life carbon approach. Because you need materials to build, you need insulation so that a building is more energy efficient, hence reducing the operational emissions. But there is a trade-off there. So unless we look at everything together, we're not able to actually reach net zero. And that is, we see that also starting to happen. Again, Nordic countries certainly have a certain leadership, but I'm very happy that under the GlobalABC, we're also addressing this issue around materials, construction, and the link with energy efficiency. So maybe the last and most important thing will be that the demand side, as you mentioned, is starting to put requirements. Mm-hmm. So we need to start setting absolute targets on where we need to reach. So a building that is planned today, or let's say a neighborhood, and maybe comes into life in 2030, should be net zero in operation. So it has to be planned already for that. And it should also reduce radically the upfront emissions. So we need to start thinking in these terms. We have thought in relative terms so far. Yeah, let me reduce here a bit and there a bit, intensity targets. But we, especially in the planning process, and again, you made that point very well, if we do it all the way upfront, then we can actually prove it doesn't necessarily cost more. It has to be planned differently, but it needs more collaboration to actually achieve that. So yeah, I think we're starting a really interesting journey over the next few years, but we need many more to join this and help us do that.
Thank you, Roland. So I'll turn to Magali because we'll have like.
I set you up.
No, that was also my plan. No, but just to kind of get the perspective of a company specifically, and I mean, Holcim being very active overall around the world, or with construction projects. I mean, what is it from your perspective? How important circularity aspects are in the context of the work of Holcim and its strategy and vision, and then what are the measures actually that you are looking into that can actually really contribute to achieving, reducing embodied carbon and achieving this? So getting the perspective of some concrete actions that are happening on the Holcim side.
Thank you, Jonathan. So I don't know if I need to introduce Holcim, but it's the biggest maker of building materials, cement and concrete. So basically at the heart of the discussion today, clearly. And I thought you did a great setting of the scenes with your slides earlier of what the challenges ahead in terms of urbanization and the fact that cement will be needed not just for the urbanization, but also for the energy transition work that is required in the coming years. So what do companies like us, and then I will go to circularity, but just I want to give an overview. We clearly understand being an international, one of the big players, not an SME. Fortunately, we are not in Senegal, but we clearly understand that our role is to drive that transition, to make cement and concrete low carbon at scale. We're not looking for niche here. We are looking, I often say, my job is to decarbonize 200 million tons of cement. That's what my duty is and nothing else. And the way we do it is several. We have taken a pledge to net zero. We got our 2030 and 2050 targets validated by Science-Based Target Initiative. So we are doing that very rigorously and very scientifically. There are things we know how to do already today, and we can do today, which is basically decarbonizing via replacing our fossil fuel by waste, which is one of the circular economy contributor. We can also replace what we call clinker. Clinker is what makes the cement by byproduct from other industries, such as slag and fly ash, which would end up being landfilled if not. So that we know how today. That allowed us to already reduce our CO2 by 29% since 1990. And we are going to continue pushing those. And it's also allowed us to put today on the market. So you find today concrete in our case in 24 markets, again, not in Senegal because we're not there, but in 24 markets that are 30% lower CO2 than the average concrete. So that's a start. That's good. That we can do today. But the next step, which is way more important, is first to increase that demand. In about less than 2 years, that low-carbon concrete represents now about 10% of our sales. Not enough. We could transform tomorrow morning all our sales if we had 100% demand. But is 30% enough? No, it's not. So not only we need to continue reducing, and this is where things like CCUS, carbon capture, usage, and storage will become in force. For the moment, we force it in 2030, so our roadmap to zero does not require it until 2030, but also because we don't think we are ready yet to do CCUS. And when I say we, I'm not talking Holcim, I'm talking everybody, because to do CCUS, you need unprecedented collaboration, not just on the technical side, but also on the financial side, as you were mentioning. And that's not something we don't see that happening in the next 2-3 years. That's why we don't think there will be serious CCUS in place in our industry before 2027, 2028, which is sad because we have 30 pilots ongoing now, and they could certainly go way quicker. But then, going back to circular economy, we do use, for our own decarbonization, 54 million tons of waste today, so that we retreat, reuse. To put things in perspective, I am French. Veolia is a huge waste treatment company. We retreat more waste than Veolia does. So some people say we are a waste treatment company that does cement as a byproduct. I think I quite like that concept. So that's a good way to use circularity. We also use construction demolition waste, which is basically the concrete at the end of its life. When you destroy the building, we grind it back, put it back in our cement. We only do that in Switzerland, not because we are based there, but because Switzerland today is the only country in the world that has the norm that allows it. So hopefully the norm should be allowed in all of Europe by the end of this year, so we'll be able to create that. But think about it. You have an old building, I take the same concrete, I make the new cement with it straight there. Zero emission, right? And so another, putting elements. Another one is the evolution of norms. I think today, innovation is going way faster than the evolution of norms. And that's clearly something slowing down companies like us. Now, the next thing, which for me, it's really, I won't say the holy grail, but almost, it's really changing the business model. And that's now, we're not talking about concrete or cement anymore. I'm talking about how can I build more with less. And believe it or not, we want that. So we, concrete company, it's not that I want to sell less concrete. I want to be incentivized to sell less concrete. Today, as long as my discussion with anyone building something is about how much do you pay my cubic meter of concrete, I am incentivized to sell as many cubic meter of concrete as I can. Well, I want to be incentivized to sell something, to sell a full object. Then now my interest is to put as little concrete as possible in it. But if I am only paid by the cubic meter of concrete instead of the performance, then why would I do it? So today we are, for example, partnering with ETH University on a flooring system. Don't know how I can do that with the microphone, but basically it's a flooring that has that shape, which is an old Roman shape. And what it does is it chooses the strengths of the construction design in such that you reduce drastically the amount of concrete you need, but also the amount of reinforcement, because the CO2 that don't only come from the cement, it also comes from the rebars. And something like that is great. It's ready. We are going to have our first real-life pilots before scalability, in the coming months. But again, if as a material maker, I don't have the discussion on the final object, then why would I do it? So because Holcim, we are trying to position ourselves as the leader in sustainable and innovative material, we are really pushing that agenda, but there is a moment where we will need that both works together, that we're not the only one pushing.
Thank you, Magali. You mentioned, specifically policies, again, as an enabler. And certainly it's a very important point, because even when, people come up with like new materials, or, they currently also need to be standardized for security, for a number of things before you can use them in the building. And, thinking of the TIFA boards, I don't know exactly how it is in Senegal on that, but that's, I think, also a challenge to bring actually some of the very nice innovations in the mainstream and actually get them implemented. And then, of course, I think it's really important to actually have, like, I would say, front runners, as we were mentioning earlier, the Nordic countries, but I think it's also in between all the stakeholders. So, I mean, some need to lead by example, and it's really good to see that, some of the important companies in the construction sector are really taking this very seriously and actually taking this role of a front runner. So I think that's really important. I also think that governments are actually part of the ones that really need to kind of make the case and front runners. If you look at governments are in many countries the ones that are the buyers of the biggest part of the cement. So if they decide that it's only low carbon cement that they want to buy, then of course all the manufacturers of cement will make sure they make low carbon, because otherwise they won't be able to actually get the market out. Anyway, I will turn now to my other colleagues and okay, starting with Andrew. I mean, we've been talking about, and I think it's the role of the United Nations on the one end, is actually bringing all these stakeholders together to make sure that, we work together to come to the solutions. And so I was, listening to everyone. I was actually thinking about, like, okay, what role do we play in that, and how do we see that, taking shape? And maybe also to understand from, UN Habitat side, like, how do you kind of promote this whole circularity and sustainable material agenda, and how it actually contributes to your agenda, which is actually about improving the livelihood of a number of people that are currently living in slums or, in very bad conditions, I would say. How can we bring them up, and how can we actually make sure that, they benefit from these innovations that are like, the sustainable material part in the circularity. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Jonathan. And thanks for the invitation. It's lovely to be here. I'm going to riff on your avoid, shift, improve framework at the beginning, which is a framework I find extremely helpful. Because it really reinforces for us, it's not just about retroactive retrofits, important as they are, but we have to, I think, put a lot more emphasis on proactively preventing the repetition of mistakes of the past. And that's extremely important, working for impact toward 2030. 90% or more of the growth and this doubling of the built environment that you mentioned is going to be happening in developing countries. And unfortunately, and I say this as an ex-architect myself, it's a lot of the bad mistakes of the 20th century, highly inefficient patterns that are being replicated. And I think even talking about embodied and operational aspects of carbon within buildings, it's not just decisions about buildings themselves that are determining these, but much wider decisions about patterns that determine massing, arrangement, envelope, commuting patterns between buildings. And it's very easy, because of the complexity of these things, to deal with them. So I think one of the things we're doing is working with governments. We're trying to work with governments to set much more sustainable patterns at the city-region scale. Difficult to do, but I think a lot of this, actually to respond to something Donovan said earlier, a lot of this is not just about the supply, but about the demand. A lot of the cities we're working in emerging economies, looking at development for growing middle class, we will see, despite all the evidence, right, for in terms of resource efficiency and emissions and time and cost of commute, we know that or we think we know, that a compact, integrated, and connected city wins the day. But then the majority of people we talk to in these cities still want large, single-family, freestanding house in a gated compound that requires a drive to the mall, all the sorts of things that set into play a sort of downward spiral of resource consumption and material usage. And we will frequently ask mayors, why did you approve this to be built? And a lot of mayors will say, well, it's the only thing that makes profit for a developer. And we'll talk to the developer and we'll ask the developer, well, you know better. Why did you build this? And they'll say, it's all people want. And we talk to residents, as we try to do, and frequently residents will say, but it's all there is. So there seems to me to be a kind of triple catch-22 that requires a complex intervention, but I think it's an iterative approach. We need to start building places that people want, so that they see there are other options possible, so that demand, bit by bit does sort of increase. Because once these wider patterns are in place, it can be very difficult and expensive to change at the building scale, because things are baked in, right? A lot of the materiality, as important as these shifts and improvements are. So we're working on things like planned city extensions and development appropriateness mapping, all to kind of set the stage in cities that are growing very quickly. Other side of that spectrum, equally important, I think to wrap up, I'll just mention a new initiative we've established with the International Union of Architects. It's called the UIA 2030 Award with UN Habitat. We're looking at different practices, a lot of which in retrofitting existing buildings that, to complement the guidelines that we publish as much as we believe in and are enthusiastic about these guidelines. I think it's much more convincing to see real built projects on the ground that have successfully contended with challenges and are continuing to do so years into their completion and life cycle. And two or three that really come to mind that these are about to be announced at the World Urban Forum, end of the month in Katowice. So I don't prejudice the winners, but two that really came to mind were a center in Denmark that made heavy use of locally produced reeds in the cladding. And on somewhat the other side of the world, a community public space in a rural village in mountain China that had excavated old caves. And with the rubble, much of which had personal nostalgic value for elderly populations rebuilt as a series of community spaces and artisan workshops. A community center where there hadn't been one for 80 years. And I like this pairing because it deals both with renewable materials as a way to retrofit old buildings, and it deals with discarded materials. So clearly we see scope on both sides. Ideally, avoiding in the first place, we're going to double the extent of our built environment. That's both terrifying and exhilarating, I suppose, but it doesn't absolve us from the responsibility of fixing what we've already built. I think that's it for me. Thanks.
Thank you, Andrew. I mean, certainly, I think showcasing successes is a very important thing, and I mean, Magali was mentioning about incentives, but I remember at some point in Brussels, actually, there was, they basically offered entrepreneurs to come up with their way to build like a zero-emission building, but it was kind of a contest, and it actually worked really well because it really gave an incentive for entrepreneurs to come up with great innovative ideas and actually get really supported by the city for it. So I think these type of things are really things that can help, promoting what can be done differently and actually show the people really how it can improve their lives also. And respond to everyone. So Samantha, you're last, but I hope we still have time then to continue discussing a little bit. I know time is flying. I mean, UNOPS is looking more broadly at infrastructure. And, I think buildings are not on their own. They're all part of a city, a neighborhood, linked to a number of systems that are integrated. So Roland was talking about the systems approach that is needed, in the built environment overall. I wanted to kind of get the perspective of how UNOPS takes into account, this transition towards more sustainable materials in the built environment.
Thank you, Jonathan, and we're delighted to be invited to speak on this panel. For those of you who may not be familiar with the United Nations Office of Project Services, basically we serve the United Nations and other partners in humanitarian emergencies, development and initiatives, peace and security priorities in 80 different countries. In over 80. And last year, we built 20 schools, 10 hospitals, 62 health clinics, just as a sample. And I think also, because I'm hoping that I can provide some of the bottom-up perspective in terms of the challenges that we face, we actually provided 6.1 million days of paid work for local people. So this is really important for UNOPS, is to work with the local economy, the local workforce. So I think that so many of the challenges that we face when we're trying to implement these things are things that the speakers have touched on. I think that one of the key things is actually having data, having local intelligence. What can you do in these challenging contexts? And then once you know this, how do you adapt technology? How do you transfer that technology locally? And of course, there's the enabling environment, which we've talked about a lot in terms of policies and plans and standards and regulations and all of that, which we think is absolutely fundamental. We're just seeing it from a slightly different perspective. I think that I'd also just say that the circular economy, from my perspective, is like another paradigm shift, which it needs to happen. We need to leapfrog, but that's like a really significant change of the way that we're thinking, which we do need to address. So just touching on sort of like these sort of three areas where we're doing something. Basically, in terms of data and local intelligence, in the first instance, UNOPS is the first agency to include mandatory sustainable procurement into solicitation and contract types. So this enables us to build in environmental criteria, And we have a tool which is called Drive, which gives us an oversight on suppliers and how they're managing and mitigating their climate impacts. In terms of UNOPS as a whole, we've actually agreed to, to the commitment of reducing our climate impact by 40% in the next few years. And we already have been working on our operations side, but we've taken on the challenge of looking at our project portfolio. And although I mentioned numerous buildings, and buildings are the largest part of our portfolio, but they're always integrated with other things, and so we do a lot of other types of infrastructure. It's very diverse and it's a very difficult context, but what we don't actually have is the data. And so, it was mentioned, we need to move from, just talking about relative intensity to actually informed decision making. And so to do that, we're investing into research around the methodology, around what's out there in the places that we work on, the things that we do, so that we can actually have better conversations with the partners that we're working with to make better choices about what they're implementing. On the other, the second point is about technology adaptation. This is obviously this is a priority. This is about materials and directly about materials and also construction processes. But I would say that we can talk about we did a climate communication center in Indonesia, which was made of bamboo. The structure was significantly bamboo, which was really important in terms of moving against the sort of logging issues that they had there. But I also think that there's a huge opportunity that we are sort of, on the journey towards, which is around nature-based solutions. So again, this is like, how can you just avoid some of the use of these materials altogether? And we have several different projects that we have worked on, including drainage system in Sri Lanka, also a slope stabilization, natural slope stabilization project in Freetown. So we're really looking at how we can do more with nature-based solutions. We're doing a lot of that with UNEP. But the third and final thing that I'll touch on is the enabling environment. So we know this is really the backbone of how infrastructure is planned, financed, delivered, managed, and it determines whether we get sustainable, resilient, and inclusive infrastructure and whether it's achieved. And so we look at upstream policies and plans. I think one of the biggest challenges we have is that it's very difficult to go into these countries and talk about changing their policies and plans when there's very little to look to reference. And I thought that the presentation on Finland was really helpful to see, here are the front runners, this is where they are, how do we get there as well in all the places that we work? It's a huge challenge. And downstream, of course, there's standards, QA processes enforcing this, as has been mentioned. So one of the things that UNOPS works with governments is around a holistic understanding of their enabling environment and how it supports infrastructure. So we do an analysis with them, which is really covering sort of multi-sectoral, cross-disciplinary view of the government. And in that way, we can make recommendations. Now, we're working currently on the SDG 12 project, resource efficiency, as we were talking about with One Planet Network. And here we've actually tailored this tool in this process to focus on resource efficiency. And to give you an idea of how we've tailored it, for example, we've emphasized the whole manufacturing process, so the extraction of materials, the processing of materials. So this was something that wasn't as sort of visible before. So I think that is so that's now being incorporated into this country construction assessment tool, RECAT, and it's part of the Rethink Buildings Toolkit. So I think I will leave it at that in terms of some ideas of what UNEP's doing in this area.
Thank you, Samantha. I mean, we have, in principle, 3 more minutes, but I hope we can take a little bit time over the coffee break, which is supposed to start in 3 minutes from now, and then half an hour later there will be a plenary here for the last session of today. I mean, you mentioned 2 things for me that I think are really important in data, which is like, I think we're all a bit struggling with that one. I mean, it's even, I would say, in our more, like, let's say, developed countries, it's not that easy. But then, if you go to a number of other countries, it becomes even more complex. I mean, some countries don't even know what their building stock is. I mean, no idea about it. It's, they know the number of permits they gave over the last 10 years, and that's kind of what they know of their buildings. And the other thing that you mentioned that I think is really critical is, well, localizing. I mean, it's, the solutions that we're having here are not the solutions for everywhere. And while we can learn from, the experiences of others and, see what we can take away from it, the real solution actually needs to be tailored to the reality of the context where we are. But to do that, you need the data. So, I mean, maybe one point I will ask to all panel members is like, how do we overcome the data challenge? In my experience, I've been in the UN for a long time. And, in the UN, we've been putting forward a number of systems saying, like, this is the data that you need to collect on the environment. This is the data that, these are the indicators that you should have. But then the problem that there is, I think, is that nobody supports the implementation of it in the countries. And then Donovan was mentioning, like, okay, but if I'm a banker, I want evidence that my project is a strong project. But if I don't have the data, how can I convince the banker that actually what I'm going to do is actually going to respond to it? So we're in a kind of catch-22 situation that, if we don't support more on the data side, or if we don't find ways around the data challenge, we might actually end up being in a difficult situation for quite some time. So I don't know if any of the panel members wants to kind of react on that challenging question. So please, Magali.
I will be very fast, I promise. I just want to say for us in data, going back to what Roland said earlier about the whole life cycle assessment, there is something very simple called EPD, Environmental Product Declaration, which gives the total life cycle CO2 impact of your product. That's something today we can give to our client anytime. Unfortunately, we are not asked very often to give it. So I think the data is not just, is it available? I think at least a major material company like us have that data, but we are really, I mean, it's a very, very small percentage of projects where we are being asked when we want to be asked that data, because we know our material that has such a bad reputation, when you look at the total world life cycle, is actually pretty competitive on a CO2 point of view. So we would love to be able to give that data if anyone asks for it.
Thank you, Magali. Roland.
And maybe just to be a bit polemic, I don't think data is the absolute key issue that keeps us from taking action. Yes, it is important to make really informed decisions. And interestingly, it was the industry who pushed for EPDs. At the time, it was really coming from industry, from companies who said, well, we have better products, so we want to prove that they are better. And then it has made its way into regulation, etc. So they are key. But I think what, unfortunately, Andrew had to leave, but what he was saying, we need to overcome this circle of blame and really work on. So that's, for me, the main question. Cities are looking at this. Industry is looking at this. Finance is looking at this. We're all looking at this problem at the moment. But how do we overcome that inertia in the system? So as you said, that we don't just continue with business as usual. And then once we start asking better questions, we will also ask for that data. So I actually think it's available. We even developed the building system carbon framework, so it really helps you. You can put all the data you want. You know exactly your full life cycle emissions. And yes, it can be improved, but you can ask any engineer or people on construction site. They can tell you how much of something is in it. You know the emission factor. So you can come up with good estimates. But how do we really drive action, even with incomplete data? So we need to work on both, data, but really action.
Thank you, Roland.
Yes,
Sheikh,
just to add that the question of data is a real problem in Africa, particularly in Senegal. in terms of collection, treatment, and provision to the benefit actor, it's a real problem. Even if you have a national agency of demography and statistics who have to take in charge this question, I said that it will be it's a real problem. In many sectors, it is difficult to have the question data and to planify and to follow all you are doing. It's not easy. Really, it's not easy. I don't know here, but in Africa, it's a real problem. Yes.
Thank you, Sheikh. I mean, I hear your point, Roland, that I think it's critical to have all the partners working together and to see how we can overcome things.
Yes.
The reason why I was mentioning data is that even if you look at Europe and you look at social housing developers that are thinking of like I need to decarbonize my whole building stock. First of all, I don't really know how to go about it. But if I want to get access to that green finance, I need to show them like how many emissions I'm going to be able to reduce and what are my solutions. But I don't even know what my solutions are. And so I think that the thing is that and that's why we are working, for example, on promoting the idea of the building passport, so that you can actually have a repository of data on all the buildings, and that would help, hopefully in the future, become something common, and that will help a lot. But I really think I see data as a strong challenge, especially. I do quite a bit of fundraising, and when I'm trying to convince, it's really difficult to kind of, and so I also think, and maybe that's a call to, I don't know, all the ones that are funding development around this world. You should also fund support to actually get the data, because then we will be able to demonstrate to you that actually we can solve the issue and we can quantify. But if we don't have that, we will still be in this situation, and we have to find ways to overcome with. And I don't think we need the exact data, but we need pretty good estimates that are convincing, and so there's still quite a bit of work on that area. Maybe just I know that there were, Branyo, I think maybe 2 questions coming from our online colleagues. So maybe I will, and then maybe 1 question from the floor. And then I will have to close, because otherwise many people will not be happy to not have a coffee break before they go to the next session. But yeah. Okay, let me look at which one that works best. Yeah, maybe.
Any questions from the audience?
Yes,
so we have a microphone here.
Maybe just.
Any questions?
Maybe I'll get the questions from the floor first. Then.
I'm Sanjay from the SPP program, One Planet Network. So my question is, like, it was very interesting presentation made by all the speakers. We know that the local material is very good in terms of sustainability, right? But when you, as you said, like most of the buildings, 50% of the buildings stocks which is going to come by 2020 is not even built today, right? So when you go and speak to people who are staying in the buildings made by their ancestors using the local materials, right? They said that I've been living in the locally built materials, but they have an aspiration to live in a building, made using the cement and concrete and steel, which is a big source of embedded carbon. So how do you address the aspirational aspect of the people in the Asia and Africa? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I know, we all know that is a very important challenge. It's like a question of social status and having the impression that if you live in a building, like maybe where the richer people live, it's actually it makes you feel better to have the same type of building. At the same time, I would say you are looking at a lot of projects today in some of those countries where the people are building eco-lodges, for example, that are super luxury, and it's actually the higher end of people now that are going into that type of more vernacular architecture. We can see that also, like if you think about countries like Niger or even some of the countries of the Sahel where the earth constructions are coming back, and it's actually architects that even the one that won, the major prize in architecture was actually one that built with Francis Kéré, who's a Senegalese, Burkinabese citizen and architect, and he won like the international prize, but he's focused on earth construction. So there's still kind of, I think this tendency will transform when people will see that actually the people that are the more successful are actually living in those type of buildings. So, I mean, I responded more for the panel, but yeah, that's my thought about it.
Sure. Nice to meet you. Benjamin Simmons with the ISD, International Institute for Sustainable Development, Director of Sustainable Infrastructure. Just a quick question on life cycle analysis. Many of the speakers mentioned it. It's obviously a key consideration. I'm just wondering to what extent you've seen life cycle analysis being brought into the actual decision-making process, the financial decision-making process in terms of integrating it into the cost-benefit analysis and also into the financial modeling. It seems that that would be a critical step. It's not just about having the data, it's also plugging the data into the right decision-making frameworks. And just to what extent have you been involved in processes that have done that? Thanks.
I'd second that. It's certainly not happening yet. I think if you're a financier today, you're looking at the energy and energy efficiency profile of projects. But we also start seeing now a demand from, for example, investor networks, who again, they come from their own net zero commitments across their portfolio, and they want to start measuring the whole footprint of projects they're measuring. So it's early days, but I do think the technical discussion on LCA is quite mature. And so we need to make now that translation into what does it mean when you finance a project. And so, for example, one report we issued last year was about what types of requirements can you put in as an investor, as a developer, to reduce embodied carbon upfront. There's things you can do in your policy, in your requirements that you set. Maybe the kind of valuation and really hardcore finance is maybe the next step. So also sharing more lessons. Often you can even save quite a lot of money if you do things smartly. The problem is you often push the cost upfront. You need longer for the planning process, but you actually have quite some savings. So I think life cycle assessment needs to be accompanied by life cycle costing, ultimately. And it's maybe only just starting, I would say. Seriously starting.
Thank you, Roland. Maybe, I don't know, Harry, because I think that, it's something that you showed also, like, from the perspective of the Nordic countries, this is specifically something that you're looking at to integrating also, and maybe you can give, as you are front runners on that, and not that, as you say, you have not solved all the issues. It's still kind of experimental, but at least you are taking real steps towards that integration. So maybe if you can give your perspective to that question.
No, maybe about this data issue is of course an issue in Nordic countries and even in Finland. And there's also questioning about is it accurate enough, the data that we are using. But my answer to this question is that we should have the direction, not the accuracy. That's the main point. If we just trying to achieve like perfect data, we will never ever come to the solution.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, Jonathan, data is a means to an ends, right? We're trying to get good enough data to make good enough decisions to move ahead. If we wait around for perfect data, or constantly look for more and more and more data, then it becomes an ends in itself, and we've missed the point of it. It's to help us to make informed decisions. And I think one of the challenges that we find anyway with data, and we've recently, on our website, we have a commitment to open source data. One of the challenges that's there with regards to data is not that it's always absent, but it's so scattered and fragmented, and it's almost impossible to access. So, the private sector holds data with some degree of confidence, but even within the public sector, data is fragmented across ministries, across agencies, at various spheres of government and so on. It's a real quagmire to actually bring the data together so you can see the picture. So part of the challenge is actually just understanding what's out there and then knowing where to look for it and then bringing it together so you have a good enough picture to make those decisions.
Thank you very much, Donovan. I'm sorry, but I think I've just been told that we need to close because, of course, I think they need to prepare the room for the final session today. But yeah, I'll make it very short. I just want to thank really all the panel members for their active contribution to the topic. And thank you also for the online participants. And I'm sorry I didn't pick up your questions, but the time was too short and we started too late. So thank you, everyone. And let's hope we can transform the sector.
Thank you very much.